UConn and the Big 12 paused their conversations about joining together, and folks, it felt like I was watching a movie that I'd already seen before.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Happy Friday and welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. All right, folks, non-conference schedules revealed for a pair of WCC teams, and it highlights a big frustration that I have about non-conference scheduling. So we're going to talk about that to close out the show. We also got updated recruiting rankings for 2025 and 2026 from ESPN. So we're going to talk about where the Zags targets and committed Zag, in this case, Davis Fogle, where they are ranked for ESPN. And we're going to open the show talking about the UConn to the Big 12, latest updates on that regard. For those of you on YouTube, yes, rocking a number 5 Gonzaga basketball jersey. This is in honor of Gary Bell, who about an hour before I hit the record button, it was revealed that he has been promoted to associate head coach at Northern Arizona. Friend of the program, friend of your host, and very excited for him to get that opportunity. So thought it was a good chance to toss on the jersey to give him a little love for that. But we're going to start the show with the big story coming out of the college basketball space on Thursday. Talks between UConn and the Big 12 have been put on pause. And the main thing that I took out of these two separate statements indicating this is that the statement from Brett Yormark, which I'll read it here, indicates, it says, they jointly decided to pause our conversations at this time. Meanwhile, a conversation from UConn Athletic Director David Gilbert indicated that it's not exactly mutual. Let me read the statement from Brett Yormark first. He said, he says, as commissioner, it is my responsibility to explore a variety of value-creating opportunities on behalf of the Big 12. Following detailed discussions with my conference colleagues alongside UConn leadership, we have jointly decided to pause our conversations at this time. We will instead focus our attention and resources to ushering in this new era of college athletics. Meanwhile, UConn's athletic director, here is part of his statement to the UConn fan base. Undoubtedly, many of you have followed recent media reports about the Big 12's renewed interest in UConn as a conference member. It is always our objective to put UConn in the very best position for future success. So we did engage in exploratory dialogue with the Big 12. Ultimately, the Big 12 determined that it will pause on conversations about membership expansion. As I'm recording this right now, I've seen and consumed a lot of articles, a lot of social media posts, a lot of conversation and discourse surrounding UConn and the Big 12 pausing their conversation. And I haven't seen a lot about the fact that those two statements are in direct opposition of each other. Brett Yormark said, jointly decided to pause our conversations. Meanwhile, UConn's athletic director said the Big 12 determined it will pause. Those are not the same thing. It is pretty clear that the Big 12 has backed off continuing to pursue UConn at the current moment as a potential expansion member in the Big 12 conference. And folks, if you're a longtime listener to the podcast and you were listening around this time last year, or even if you weren't listening at this time, but you were just following Gonzaga basketball, following the school, the university, this story, these last few weeks between UConn and the Big 12 should seem extremely familiar, because it played out almost exactly the same way that it did with Gonzaga. And if you were listening to this podcast, I told you when this first happened, when the UConn Big 12 rumors first happened, we talked about what it might mean for Gonzaga if it happens. We talked about whether Gonzaga would also join them in the Big 12, whether the Big East might come after Gonzaga, all these things. But one of the main takeaways from that was they're not any further along than Gonzaga was, and things suddenly stopped with Gonzaga. And that's exactly what is happening here with UConn. Here, step by step, it's exactly the same. Step one, reports that the two sides are talking emerge. Commissioner Yormark is excited about the opportunity to add a basketball school to the conference. That was step one in both events, last year, this year, Gonzaga, UConn. Step two, more reports that the sides are remaining engaged. There's discussion on the timeline. There's discussion on finances. For Gonzaga, a lot of that was how they're not as financially problematic for the Big 12 because they don't have football. Their TV power numbers started getting thrown out there. They're one of the most prolific basketball programs in the country in terms of watchability on TV. For UConn, the conversation was about how the football team is not going to be added till 2031 and how that alleviates the pressure on the other Big 12 schools in terms of costing them money from the media rights deal. And all of those conversations started happening. Step 3, it's leaked that some schools are opposed while some schools are in favor. Again, this happened exactly around the same time for Gonzaga last year and for UConn this year. The reports were that, they're getting some yes votes. And Gonzaga got some yes votes too. There were programs that were genuinely like, yep, hop on board, we're ready, let's bring the Zags into the Big 12. Same with UConn. A lot of programs said, yep, we're good. We don't have to pay for football for 5 years. They get an opportunity to get their program kind of more in line. We're ready, we're good, let's go. But there were dissenters. There were dissenters for Gonzaga, there were dissenters for UConn. And then you get to step 4, which is the indication that many of the presidents and the athletic directors, those are who vote on conference realignment, want to focus on the recent newcomers rather than continuing to expand. This was the sentiment last year, which at the time, of course, the Big 12 had already added 4 schools in Central Florida, Cincinnati, BYU, and Houston, and was about to add or had just officially had just added Colorado, Arizona State, and Utah. Now, of course, a year later, all 8 of those programs have been added to the Big 12, while Texas and Oklahoma have officially been removed from the Big 12. But the sentiment from the athletic directors, from the presidents, was exactly the same. Let's focus on what we have. We've added 8 brands to our conference in less than 2 years. That is a lot. There's a lot of change, a lot of new mouths to feed, a lot of new travel to do, a lot of new just programs to include and incorporate and have to figure out from a financial perspective, from a marketing perspective, from every possible perspective that you would have to kind of be able to work with a new entity in your conference. They got 8 of them. And so the sentiment that, hey, we would rather focus on the new teams and kind of let the dust settle, it didn't seem like that would be over in a year. And that was the sentiment we heard last year when Gonzaga eventually got abruptly kind of shut out of continued conversations with the Big 12. And so when this kind of reared its head again, and there was, UConn's a more desirable addition for the Big 12 than Gonzaga. I want to be clear. If you're a UConn listener who found the show and you think that I'm comparing the two as equal, they're not. They're not. I can concede that. I think most Gonzaga fans can concede that for the simple fact that UConn, while it is not a good football program, they have one. They have a football program. That's a huge difference. From a men's basketball perspective, UConn is better. They've won back-to-back national championships. They've beat Gonzaga 3 straight times in the last 2 years. There's no debate in that conversation either. There are very few teams in all of college basketball that are definitively, unquestionably ahead of Gonzaga. UConn's pretty clearly one of them. And then women's basketball, unfortunately, doesn't matter as much from a financial perspective as football or men's basketball, but UConn checks that box too. Again, Coach Lisa Fortier, Gonzaga, phenomenal program with where they're at. UConn's the cream of the crop. So there's no debate here that Yormark wanting UConn and trying again, taking another crack at it because it didn't work with Gonzaga, makes sense because he thought UConn was a bigger value add to the Big 12 than Gonzaga. And I think he's right in assuming that. But the reasoning that was given by the Big 12 presidents and ADs who shot down Gonzaga wasn't fixed by adding UConn. Like the reasoning that people gave for Gonzaga wasn't, well, they don't have a football program. I'm sure that was part of it, but it wasn't, oh, they don't have a football program, or, oh, their basketball team's not quite good enough. Like those weren't the reasons that were given. The reasons were we'd rather focus on who we have now. 9, 10, 11 months later, they try the same thing and they get the same response. Shouldn't be a shock. Shouldn't be a shock. This played out exactly how I thought it was going to play out because it's how it played out last time. And what does it mean going forward? Well, it means the Big 12 is the presidents and the ADs are continuing to send the message to Brett Yormark and to the rest of the college sports space. We're good for right now. I think there is another element of this, and perhaps we can get into it for a longer conversation again soon here later this month. But I think a lot of what's happening in the conference realignment space right now is everybody's trying to figure out what the heck's going on with the ACC. Everybody is waiting on the ACC. There's an element of waiting on what's going to happen with the Pac-2 and the Mountain West, but even that is still goes back to the ACC. If the ACC crumbles, like full-on falls apart, goes the way of the Pac-12, which I want to say seems unlikely, At this point, I think the odds of that happening in the next calendar year are incredibly slim. But as long as there's still a possibility of that happening, a lot of these conferences are just going to wait. Because if the Big 12 think there's even a chance they'll get Florida State, Clemson, Miami, somebody like that, 2, 3 of those programs, Duke, North Carolina, something like that, why wouldn't you wait and see if you can snap them up? The Big East is going to wait because, yeah, they might lose UConn, but if they don't lose UConn and the ACC falls apart, can they get Syracuse back? Can they get Louisville back? Can they get Boston College back? There's a football element of those conversations that I think is a lot trickier for the Big East, but it's something that they're going to at least wait and see. And if you're the Pac-2 and you're waiting to figure out, should we do this merger, this reverse merger with the Mountain West? What does that look like? You're waiting to see if Stanford and Cal are going to come crawling back. Maybe they'll bring SMU with them. Maybe that gives you an opportunity to snap up Memphis, who's soon to be without Coach Penny Hardaway based on the latest reports going on down over there in Tennessee. Maybe you can get Tulane to come over. Maybe you then start a bigger conference with the Mountain West, with your 4 schools from the Pac-12, with somebody like SMU. Maybe Gonzaga gets involved there. A lot of conference realignment conversations right now are going to be kind of put on pause until some kind of resolution happens with the ACC. If it's Clemson and Florida State bouncing and the rest of the ACC sticks together and they can try to pull somewhere from somebody else, maybe they go after UConn and try to bring them from the Big East to the ACC. UConn probably doesn't jump on that, but maybe they give it a shot. Who knows what exactly happens out of that. But if the ACC can hold steady, then conference realignment kind of picks back up in a different space. But right now, these teams have to wait and see what's going to happen there. We're going to have more conference realignment talk. Trust me, folks, it is not done. It is not an over conversation at this point, but I couldn't help but notice the extreme similarities between how things went last year at the end of the summer with Gonzaga and how they just played out between the Big 12 and UConn. Folks, we're going to move on, though. We're going to talk recruiting here. ESPN has updated their rankings for the 2025 and 2026 class. So we got a new ranking for Davis Fogle, the commit in 2025. We got new rankings for targets Nik Kamenia and Kingston Flemings in that 2025 class, as well as 2026 targets Sam Funches. We're going to talk about all of that in just a second. But first, folks, let's talk about LinkedIn jobs, because when you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. And that's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs, which has the tools to help find the right people for your team faster, and they do it for free. And LinkedIn is not just another generic job board. They help you hire professionals that you cannot find anywhere else, even those that are not actively searching for a new job, but might be open to the perfect role. And in a given month, over 70% of LinkedIn users do not visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, folks, you're not looking in the right place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. So hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn also knows that the over 2.5 million small businesses who use their app are wearing so many hats, they may not have the time or the resources to hire. And they're constantly finding ways to make that process even easier, including launching a feature that helps you write your own job descriptions. So post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Again, that's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags podcast. Moving away from our conference realignment conversation about UConn and the Big 12 and those talks stalling out to look at ESPN's updated 2025 and 2026 class rankings. Got 5 prospects in the 2025 class to talk about, and then 1 in 2026. We'll start at the top, and the rankings didn't change all that much. We did a refresh of these rankings about a month or so ago. I think they do that every single month. So some of these guys moved up quite a bit. Some of these guys stayed around where they were, but it's a good opportunity to kind of refresh on the prospects that Gonzaga is still pursuing in 2025, a few that maybe they're not pursuing as much anymore, and of course the 2026 target in Funches. We'll start with 2025, though, and we'll start with the player ranked the highest. That is and remains Isaiah Harwell, the 6'6" guard from Pocatello, Idaho, who has been on Gonzaga's radar for a very long time. Came on an official visit last February, was originally going to come for the St. Mary's game, suffered an injury and had surgery, and ended up coming a couple weeks later for the Santa Clara game in Spokane. He is 14th in ESPN's latest rankings, so not much of a change for him. He's a guy who At this point, however, the biggest update, the biggest change for Isaiah Harwell, and we talked about it quite a bit last week, he is now a strong lean to go to Houston to play for Kelvin Sampson and the Cougs. He is committing on September 12th. That has been a date set for a long time. Back when he was considered a favorite to go to Gonzaga, he has visited Cal, he's visited Houston. I think he took an official visit to Texas as well. Gonzaga was kind of the favorite for a long time. There's some indication that maybe the Zags are kind of running out of patience of like, hey, what else can we do here? We've brought you to campus. We've continued to pursue you through your injury. I don't think the Zags are out. I don't think the Zags said, hey, we're no longer, your offer has been rescinded. I'm not reporting that. I doubt that's very much the case, but I think they were like, okay, we've done all that we can do. If you're not interested in coming to our program anymore, we're going to start looking in other directions. And I think that is what led to Gonzaga's pursuit of the next player on this list, and that's Kingston Flemings. Kingston Flemings, 6'1" point guard from San Antonio. He is officially locked in at a visit to Gonzaga for Craziness in the Kennel on October 5th. That will be an official visit for him. He has a top 4 of Gonzaga, Texas, Houston, and Texas Tech. And I do think that the Isaiah Harwell and Kingston Flemings, the pursuits of these two players, the recruiting kind of paths, they've pretty clearly overlapped at this point. Harwell is being pursued by Houston, Texas, and Gonzaga. Flemings is being pursued by Houston, Texas, and Gonzaga. The rest of their lists are slightly different, but those 3 are considered the favorites for Harwell and the favorites for Kingston Flemings, so it's hard to not have these be connected. And I think looking at Flemings, just stylistically watching tape, reading about him, the scouting reports, it's pretty easy to see why Gonzaga is very interested in Kingston Flemings. He's a facilitator. He's a lead guard who loves to get out in transition, great at throw ahead passes, reads the floor extremely well, gets to the rim, is a great in the pick and roll, working on his outside shot. Again, I said this on the show and I'll say it again. If it sounds like I'm reading a scouting report of Andrew Orion Nembhard, that's because he's got a lot of similarities to those two guys. It's worked out real well for those two players in Spokane, so can totally see why Mark Few said, okay, if Harwell's kind of wishy-washy on what he's going to do here, let's go after Kingston Flemings. And to be clear, I want to, on Harwell quickly, I'm not saying he's out at Gonzaga. I don't know. I know that he's a heavy lean to Houston at this point. That is what has been reported. That is what is being indicated. Doesn't mean Gonzaga is out fully. It likely means that Gonzaga is keeping their options open because they are not as confident about Harwell coming to campus. I think that's a fairly easy thing to kind of read the tea leaves on, but it doesn't mean that they're out on him or that he is out on them. But Gonzaga's pursuit of Kingston Flemings makes a lot of sense when you look at his style of play, when you look at the fact that they are maybe not going to land the guard they were hoping to land in the 2025 class. So I think there's a lot of appeal there. And I think the other part of this is that Kingston Flemings just wrapped up representing the United States in the FIBA 3-on-3 tournament, where one of his teammates was fellow 2025 prospect and Gonzaga target Nik Kamenia. Flemings came in at 21st in the class ranking. I'm not even sure if I said that. I apologize if I missed it. So Harwell's at 14, Flemings at 21 in ESPN's updated rankings. Kamenia comes in at 35. And you've heard Kamenia's name for multiple years at this point. 6'8" forward from Harvard Westlake High School, been on Gonzaga's radar for multiple years, did an unofficial visit for Craziness 2 years ago, an official visit for Craziness last year. On3 is actually favoring him away from Gonzaga. They have UCLA and Arizona as the favorites, but all of the schools are very close bunched together. I think the fact that Kamenia and Flemings played together is a good sign. It's a good sign. The only school that overlaps in Kamenia's list and Kingston Fleming's list is Gonzaga. If those two guys loved playing together, and they did really well, things went really well for them. If they loved playing together and they think, well, we could do that at our next stop, they're going to find out that they got one connection there that makes it happen. So definitely something to keep an eye on. Kamenia would be a really great fit for Gonzaga as a bigger wing, like a 3-4 hybrid, kind of the Corey Kispert, Julian Strother ilk. He's a little bit different player than those guys, but kind of think positionally. That I think is the role that he would fill. So certainly a player to keep an eye on. And if Kamenia and Flemings loved playing together, they could be joined in the 2025 class by Davis Fogle. Again, the only known commit for Gonzaga in the 2025 recruiting class at this point. He is 43rd in ESPN's updated ranking. That is the second highest among the 4 major recruiting services. 247 Sports has Fogle all the way up at 33, while both Rivals and On3 have him outside of their top 60. He's been a polarizing prospect. Some places have had him a lot higher, a lot lower. I think some of it is just updating their rankings. Some places are a little slower to do updates, and that's why he's a little lower on those lists, because every time any major outlet updates their rankings, he is climbing higher and higher and higher. He's been doing phenomenal work this summer. I just posted right before hitting the record button on my Instagram account, Locked On Zags. We're on Instagram, by the way. I don't advertise that much, but go give us a follow if you don't yet. I like to post 6, 7, 8 times a day on there, so definitely check it out if you haven't yet. And I posted a link to a video clip of Davis Fogle just throwing down absolute hammers all over everybody. It's a phenomenal clip, definitely worth checking out. He's been really good. He's looked really good. He looks like another great find for Mark Few and the staff on the recruiting trail. Last player in 2025 to talk about is Efiosa Oliogu. He is a forward who's playing in Atlanta right now. He's of Canadian descent, and ESPN did not rank him in their top 100. Most services do 150. Some even do 250. 247, I think, has 250 recruits that they have ranked. ESPN only has 100, and they do not have him in their top 100, which is the only one of the 3 recruiting services that do not. Rivals actually has him up at 43, while On3 has him at 68, and 247 Sports has him at 87. High-level athlete. Watch clips of him. He's always dunking. He's a big 3, kind of a 2-3 hybrid, probably would play 3 in Gonzaga's offense. The Zags are in his top 7, but are not seen as the likeliest landing spot. The only one of his top 7 schools that he's visited is Maryland. Most people think that's where he's going to end up, is at Maryland. Maryland, Gonzaga, as well as Bama, Arizona State, Memphis, Oklahoma State, and TCU round out the top 7 there. And then lastly, Sam Funches, 2026 prospect, the only known target for Gonzaga in the 2026 class at this point. I say known because it doesn't mean that they're not talking to more players, making soft scholarship offers, or even potentially making hard scholarship offers that we just haven't heard about yet. Regardless, Funches came in at 43 on the 2026 recruiting top 100 for ESPN. Pretty similar to where he is elsewhere. Rivals actually has him 25th. 247 has him 35th. On3 has him 44. Big man from Mississippi, 6'10", rim protector, got some outside shooting ability. Ole Miss is considered the front runner, which makes sense. He's a hometown kid. Chris Beard is a great recruiter, but Gonzaga has been in on Funches for a long time, so absolutely a name worth keeping an eye on. Well, we're going to close out the show talking about a pair of WCC teams who released their non-conference schedules this week, and it highlights one of my biggest complaints and issues about non-conference scheduling, and I'm not blaming either of these teams. I'm blaming Power 5 schools. We're going to talk about that to close out the show. Right after I tell you about today's sponsored Gametime. Folks, it's college football season. It's finally here, and as somebody who lives close to multiple local venues, I love that I can make a last-minute decision to head out to a stadium. And that's why I use Gametime, because prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to kickoff. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's planning to go to that battle in Seattle, in that Climate Pledge Arena against Mark Pope and the Kentucky Wildcats, and you haven't got your tickets yet, you can go on Gametime right now in section 216. They got 2 tickets for $58. It is their super deal. They also have a super deal right on the baseline, literally just a few rows up from the baseline of the floor, $157 per ticket. That is a phenomenal deal. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. You can get those tickets for $58. You can get them for $38 if you use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. Download the Gametime app today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, folks, closing out the show today, talking non-conference scheduling. We're still not quite done with Gonzaga's non-conference schedule. We are almost there. We're waiting on final confirmation about where and when that Baylor game is going to be played. For those of you who listened last week, we reported that there is an indication that this game is going to take place in Mexico City on November 6th against the Baylor Bears. It has not been confirmed yet, but it was reported on the show by Rocco Miller. Regardless, I want to focus on 2 other WCC teams and take a look at their just reported full non-conference schedules. We'll start with San Francisco. The Dons this year are playing at home Cal Poly, Boise State, Long Beach State, Chicago State, Mercyhurst, St. Louis, Stanislaus State, and Montana. On neutral floors, they're playing Memphis, and that's at the Chase Center. So it is a neutral, but it is pretty clearly a basically home game for the Dons. And they're playing Loyola Chicago in Milwaukee, which is obviously the opposite. That's basically a road game for the Dons. And then in terms of an actual road game, they're going on the road to take on Bradley. They're also playing in the Sunshine Slam MTE in Daytona Beach. They will open against Clemson, and then they will play either Penn State or Fordham, depending, of course, on whether they beat Clemson and who wins between Penn State and Fordham. Power 5 teams do not want to play teams like San Francisco. Last year, the Dons were lucky to get a couple Power 5 teams on the schedule, but it was DePaul, who was the second worst Power 5 team in college. Actually, I think they were the worst. I think they were worse than Louisville. It was Vanderbilt, who was the worst SEC team, and it was Minnesota, who I don't think was the worst Big Ten team, but they weren't particularly good. So if you cannot get Power 5 teams to play you, do what San Francisco did. Go play the best dang mid-major teams that you can. And you think about the best mid-major college basketball conferences outside of the WCC, which of course would not be a non-conference game for the Dons. The best basketball conferences that are not Power 4, Mountain West, American Athletic Conference, A10, and Missouri Valley Conference. Pretty clearly, it is those four and the WCC are kind of in a class of their own outside of the Power 4. San Francisco got them all covered. St. Louis and Loyola Chicago are both in the A10. They're playing Loyola in a pseudo road game. They're playing St. Louis at home. Memphis is their game at the Chase Center. They're in the American Athletic Conference. They're going on the road to take on Bradley, who might win the Missouri Valley Conference this year. And of course, they're playing Boise State at home out of the Mountain West. We'll talk a bit more about their schedule, but I also want to tell you Pacific's schedule. And I want to highlight this. Here's who Pacific is playing at home. Jessup, Northern Arizona. Shout out Gary Bell once again. Arc Pine Bluff, Fullerton, Portland State, and Idaho. Not a lot of fun, not a lot of competition in that home schedule for Pacific. Here's who they're playing on the road. Arkansas, Missouri, Colorado, Illinois State, UNLV. And then they have an MTE in Hawaii to open up the season, the Rainbow Classic. They're playing San Jose State, Life Pacific, and then Hawaii, which technically is going to count as an actual road game, even though it is part of an MTE. So here's the simple thing, the simple issue here. You, pretty much everybody who watches college basketball, who's aware of the WCC, would rather see San Francisco play Arkansas or Colorado or Missouri or even UNLV. But instead we get Pacific. And I'm not trying to bag on the new coaching staff at Pacific. I think Dave Smart's going to do some good things. I think this team has some exciting talent on the team. They get Elijah Fisher, a good transfer, Lamar Washington from Texas Tech. But Pacific finished 351st, 359th maybe in the Ken Palm rankings last year. Pacific was one of the worst teams in college basketball last year. That is why they're going on the road to play Arkansas. That is why they're going on the road to play Colorado and Missouri. And because San Francisco was good and has been good and beat a Power 5 team last year and is good enough to win the majority of games that they play, like they're not going to beat UConn more than once out of 10 times, but Pacific's 0 for 10. San Francisco's maybe once. And those teams aren't willing to risk that. So even though everybody would rather see San Francisco take on Arkansas, I would love that game. I don't think the Dons would win, but again, they have a better chance than Pacific. And I'm picking on John Calipari. He actually does a pretty good job of being willing to play multiple teams. There's a lot of things you can complain about with Cal, but he's not one of the coaches that tends to fall into this trap too much. But ultimately, when I looked at San Francisco's non-conference schedule, I thought this is great, but they're limited. They're hamstrung because if they could play UCLA and USC and Oregon, or even if they didn't want to be on the West Coast, if they wanted to go play teams in the SEC or wanted to go play teams in the Big Ten, they're not getting those opportunities. Nobody's going to schedule a home and home where they're going to come to San Francisco. So they do have the advantage of having the Chase Center, and I think that helps them get games like Minnesota, who they played there last year, and then beat. And then now look, they don't get a power team there; they get Memphis. And whereas Pacific, maybe things will get better for them this year, but they're getting opportunities to play better teams and games that I think Chris Gerlison and the Dons would love. And I say them. It's same with Santa Clara, same with now Wazoo, who's in this conference. It's certainly same with St. Mary's. They're getting those opportunities because of how bad they were. That feels backwards. And I'm not going to go through the whole explanation, but I get it. If you're sitting there trying to explain to me why, I get it. I understand why. I understand how the net rankings work. I understand that teams get rewarded for pounding the doors off of bad teams. I understand that when you're trying to fill out your schedule, you just got to pay a team, a couple $100,000 to fly out to your arena and lose. Like, I get it. That's how college basketball has pretty much always worked. It's similar to how football works in a lot of ways too. It's not new or unique to the sport. But when you look at a team like the Dons or Santa Clara, or even if you go outside of this conference, you look at teams like Nevada and UNLV in the Mountain West, or you look at Dayton, St. Louis, whatever, Oral Roberts in the Summit League, like good mid-major teams who cannot get anybody good to play them. And then you can't put together a resume capable of getting you an at-large bid in the NCAA tournament. And since you're not making the NCAA tournament, you're not getting recognition. Therefore, you're not getting a bump in recruiting. Therefore, you're staying at the same level. Therefore, those teams aren't going to play you. And the cycle continues and continues and continues and continues. And if you're Gonzaga, you break out of it after, 13 years, 15 years, something like that. I was a senior in 2013, and they, at that point, still really struggled with non-conference games. They got Illinois in the house my senior year. That was huge. That was a huge deal. They got West Virginia in the house, I think, my junior year. That was a big deal. But prior to that, they played Michigan State. Okay, I remember Draymond Green going nuclear against the Zags. So they got a few good games prior to 2013, but it took a decade. And it's not happening at these other schools as fast as it took St. Mary's. I mean, it's still not really happening for St. Mary's. They're trying. It's not happening. And it's a frustrating reality of the sport. I don't know the solution. I wish I did. A return to RPI rewards teams more for going on the road. So perhaps you'd see more power teams be willing to play road games, but I still don't think they would be playing teams like the Dons. They'd be playing other power teams in true road environments. So there's still fixes that need to be done. I don't know the solution. I just know that good mid-major teams are getting punished while bad mid-major teams are getting rewarded with opportunities to play better teams. And I don't think that that is how it should continue to operate for the enjoyment of watching college basketball. It's going to wrap it up for me today and for this week here on Locked On Zags. Folks, have a fantastic weekend. We will be back next week, continuing all these conversations. We'll got mailbag for you next week. We've got some bold predictions coming your way. We'll keep you up to date on recruiting. We'll have an update on Isaiah Harwell next week. We know that for sure. So keep your eyes peeled for that. Recruiting, bold predictions, all sorts of fun stuff. We're going to start our player preview series at the end of the month as well. Thanks again for listening, folks. Have a fantastic weekend. And until next time, as always, go Zags.